We start with a photograph. This is an image of late 90s nu metal act Limp Bizkit gaming on an industrial military-style installation rig as part of Sega's Mobile Assault Tour. A nationwide jaunt rolled out to promote the launch of Sega's brand new 128-bit console, the Sega Dreamcast, launched on the auspicious date of the 9th of the 9th, 1999, a date that has to be a marketing executive's wet dream. I'm completely obsessed with the photos of this tour. To me, they're a perfect visual capture of video games and youth culture at the turn of the millennium. The Mobile Assault Tour took a platoon of souped-up vehicles across the entirety of the United States during the heatwave summer of 1999 and allowed video game fans the chance to test the might of Sega's 128-bit powerhouse for the first time in local hangouts and shared spaces. Since the 1980s, an entire generation had grown up knowing a world that had only ever had video games in it, and they were now coming of age as rebellious teenagers. Sega of America reportedly spent $100 million on the launch of the Dreamcast, a sign of the times that by this point, video game culture was no longer a niche or a media designed merely for children. Here's another photo of lead singer Fred Durst taken around the time of the console's launch. So I want to answer a question. In late 1999, right before the turn of the millennium, just why out of all the celebrities in the world did Sega choose Fred Durst to sign a shed-load of Dreamcasts? Although we take the term for granted today, it was in the Western world during the post-war period that first gave rise to the concept of the teenager. Not quite a child, not quite an adult. It's a transitional and transformative period in a young person's life, where puberty hits and the adult psyche begins to form. Independence is discovered and boundaries get tested. These are the years where subversive ideas and forms of rebellion begin to have a serious allure. So enter counterculture. To understand counterculture, we probably should start with the rise of the American cultural empire in the post-war period. So let's start with a few examples. Not long after the Great Reset of the Second World War, disenfranchised men returning from conflict would begin to congregate and go on to form what we now know as motorcycle gangs. In the 1950s, a group called the Beatniks came to prominence and began a long pattern of young working and middle classes appropriating African American music and culture. This began a long chain of what was considered subversive cultural movements, often fueled by contraband substances and centered around musical genres that the baby boom generation now coming of age would begin to embrace. Mass media and rising living standards have a big part to play here, from the hippies and rock and roll through the 60s and 70s, into rap culture and hip hop in the 80s and 90s. By the time MTV Music Television launched in 1981, through the beginnings and the rise of continuous 24-hour streams of content on cable and satellite television, counterculture had become fully commodified and was serious big business. In the late 90s, rap and hip hop had permeated the mainstream to such an extent that rock and metal acts were now understood to be alternative music, now featured more on the secondary music channels, as the digitization of television allowed an even greater bandwidth of content to be piped into the homes of the cultural masses. Rap had emerged fully from the underground, and big credible hip hop producing acts such as the Neptunes and Timbaland were now producing music for members of boy bands and pop stars. Now you could flip channels between whatever genre you so wished, while still retaining the limitations of a shared monoculture. And in the mid-90s, hip-hop and rock were still two separate things. Yes, there were crossovers, but these were always a novelty, and the exception to the rule that you were either a metaler, rocker, grebo, grunger or whatever, or a townie, rarely both. Just like you were either usually a Sega or Nintendo kid. The crossover of those consoles was often imagined, but always a pipe dream. But we'll get to this all in a moment. Because once the American continuum of counterculture had been established, it gave us plenty of stars across the years. But video games had already given us countercultural stars of their own. To understand the existence of a super speedy blue-haired hedgehog named Sonic, you first need to understand the video game landscape prior to his existence. In the late 80s, Nintendo had achieved near complete market dominance of the North American video games market. It was a fact that could be boasted, that Nintendo's mustachioed plumber mascot with a short stature had become more famous than Mickey Mouse. There wasn't much particularly rebellious about Super Mario. His moustache was a vestigial element of the limitations of early pixel designs. It simply helped players identify his nose from his chin. The plumbing part came about because pipes were an ingenious gaming design that allowed him to port from one room or world to the next very simply. He didn't break the boundaries of decency or offer much in the way of transgression. And in fairness, this suited a family-friendly company like Nintendo very well, but it did open up a blind spot in their marketing that Sega of America were ripe to exploit. And Genesis did what Nintendo didn't? Sega hosted an internal competition to design a new character. Nato Ashima's blue anthropomorphic hedgehog design stood out, which eventually evolved into the Sonic we recognise today. The character was blue to match Sega's logo, and his design incorporated elements meant to symbolise speed and attitude, aligning with the capabilities of the Genesis hardware. Sonic felt like a complete rush to gaming when he first appeared. He had attitude, showcased by his impatient foot tapping if players left him idle. Sega backed his launch with an aggressive advertising campaign to position itself as a superior, more mature alternative to Nintendo. The perceptible hardware superiority of the 16-bit Genesis emphasised the speed and loop-the-loops of Sonic the Hedgehog, and enabled Sega to do something quite spectacular to the video games market. It went from owning less than 10% to over 50% in the space of a few years, and so they learned a valuable lesson in the power of countercultural icons. And look, you can have all the cool character designs in the world, but if you can't back it up with proper gameplay and physics and level designs that are excellent, there'll be no staying power anyway. And trust me, I remember this era well. So in the early 90s, Sonic became the first truly cool video game mascot to be recognised globally. But by 1999, the 8-year-olds that he had enamoured around his launch were coming of age, and by now, they'd already experienced a gaming brand that had found a formula for creating buzz, catapulting ultra cool into the stratosphere. 90s newcomer to the console market, Sony can take credit for laying pretty much all of the groundwork in this regard. By 1994, 3D home consoles were helping turn gaming into more of an immersive cinematic experience. During the 32 and 64-bit wars, a console generation before PlayStation had helped bring the average age of a gamer from around 14 to 24. Their extremely savvy marketing for their flagship PlayStation console dragged video games from something nerdy and embarrassing into the realms of the ultra cool. So by 1999, Sega knew that they would need to bring something more than just a cartoon blue hedgehog to the party. But there's another twist to this new metal video game match made in heaven. Fred Durst didn't just play a part in the marketing of video games, he became part of actual video games. That's right, in the early noughties, Fred Durst was a playable character in 3 video games. It's an unconfirmed rumour that he stipulated a clause in all contracts of video game syncs for his music, that if they were to use a song of his, he had to become a playable character in that particular game. So we have secret character digital versions of Jacksonville's Finest in WWF SmackDown, Just Bring It, and Fight Club on the PlayStation 2. And to me, there's something intriguing about Fred Durst, the video game character. At this particular moment in video game history, the idea that you could finally control one of your rockstar idols was quite a spectacle. Rockstars were the preserve of concert stages and music videos, not video games. Us mortals were never supposed to take control of these deities. The blurring of the boundaries between watching your idol on passive media such as television was transcended by the active, actual controlling of your idol with a gamepad. Yes, it wasn't fully immersive, but this jump is quite clear-cut, in a way that rock and pop star fans prior to this never had. Durst's appearance in a video game is somewhat transformative, as it shifted him from being a passive music icon, defined, structured and given to audiences, to an active or interactive entity, allowing audiences to engage and even become him in a digital realm. Durst's presence in-game represented a new form of celebrity engagement. In some ways, it marked the beginning of mass media extending our relationship with icons, and how we perceive and interact with fame in the digital age. Nowadays, we take this sort of thing for granted, of course. The permitted use of digital likeness and deepfakes is a hot and controversial topic these days. Movie and television stars appearing in video games is par for the course in today's generation of consoles. Less than half a decade later, the rise of social media and content communities like YouTube would further break down these barriers to celebrity and create a fair few of their own type in the process. The great walls that shut celebrity off from the masses became more like windows into the lives and experiences of the famous class. This was also a point in video games where it felt like a classic movie adaptation was being released every month or so. In Fight Club, the anti-hero Tyler Durden had an extreme and nihilistic interpretation of Nietzschean Marxism that shunned any sort of consumerism or commercialism. So there's an extreme irony in a video game adaptation of Fight Club existing in the first place. The fact that it was an, in fairness, badly made, blood-soaked beat-em-up extended this further. Unlike the original book or film, the game is clearly aimed at generating profit from ultra-violence rather than provoking thought. From something akin to Durden's neo-Marxist viewpoint, this entire affair could be considered a glorious showcase of how capitalist forces can appropriate, commodify, and ultimately neuter even the most potent critiques against itself. Possibly this was all lost on Durst, who would proclaim to have watched the movie over 25 times before the video game's release, because Durst's lyrics and actions over the period are full of the aggressive machismo that Fight Club was challenging. Sega went on to sponsor more events, including Ozfest and Blink-182 and Interscope Records tours. But little did us video game fans know that trouble was brewing for the iconic gaming manufacturer. So despite the very promising early start for the Dreamcast, by 2002, Sega had stepped into serious financial difficulties and declared defeat in the console wars, discontinuing manufacture and then support of the Dreamcast hardware. The PlayStation brand with its hit sequel console was just too dominant at this point. Around the same time, Wes Borland, the iconic guitarist and chief riffsmith of Limp Bizkit, left the band, citing creative differences, and soon after, a new lineup Bizkit released the underwhelming and aptly titled Results May Vary. This truly was the end of an era for nu metal and Sega. Broadband internet, social media and content communities, streaming platforms, smartphones, and the death of television all had a role to play in the shattering of the American youth monoculture. But the show wasn't completely over. Sega took a long hard look at itself, exited the console hardware business completely, and restructured as a multi-platform gaming software company. This of course wasn't all so bad. It meant we finally got to experience Sonic the Hedgehog on Nintendo hardware, and we were finally gifted the Sonic Mario crossover that had been long dreamed about. In 2004, Wes Borland patched up his differences and rejoined the Bizkit. And it was around a decade later in 2015 when I, now as an adult, saw them live for the first time in the Radio 110 at Reading Festival. Fred Durst came on stage and told us we were about to party like it was 1999. And while I've seen a fair few bands over the years, honestly they were really quite something. And I still have my Sega Dreamcast. I keep it hooked up with a HDMI adapter thanks to its forward-thinking support for the 480p screen resolution, a first for the time. It was a console that broke down walls, and to me it's one of the best video game consoles of all time. And it was the first major home console to be connected to the internet, and now decades later, thanks to a niche audiences of the internet, it remains a cult favourite. It's kind of strange to me that many of these things, the things that killed the monoculture, dethroned Fred Durst and mothballed the Dreamcast, kind of allow them to live on. So today, for the Sega Dreamcast and Limp Bizkit, the show goes on.